Hello, everyone. We're excited to be talking to Dr. Kate Rigby today. Dr. Rigby needs no introduction. She's a world-leading expert in environmental humanities, and she's a professor of environmental humanities and also the founding director of Research Center for Environmental Humanities at Bath Spa University in England. She is also a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities and a professor of literary studies at Monash University in Australia. She's also the founding president of the Association for the Study of Literature, Environment, and Culture. Kate, such a thrill to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
Let us start with a definition, environmental humanities. I guess in early days, it used to be called global warming studies or eco-criticism, but now the field has been transformed substantially in the past 2 decades. So I was wondering if you could tell us what environmental humanities is and what does it aim to do?
So in a very broad sense, the environmental humanities are concerned with addressing the interrelationship between culture and environment, between human cultural practices and assumptions and beliefs and social interrelationships, and also the interrelationships with the more than human world in particular locations. And I think it's probably fair to say that the term environmental humanities is being used in two somewhat different senses. In the first sense, it refers to a kind of multidisciplinary coming together, a gathering, if you like, of environmentally or ecologically oriented studies within discrete humanities and humanities leaning social sciences. So environmental history, environmental philosophy, environmental ethics, environmental literary studies, environmental religious studies, environmental anthropology, cultural geography, science and technology studies sometimes as well. So in many cases, these are lines of inquiry that have been opened up over many decades. I mean, in environmental philosophy and religious studies, you're going sort of back to the 1970s. Environmental history really emerges strongly in the 1980s. Environmental literary studies in the 90s. So eco-criticism, being a kind of ecological approach to literary studies or literary and cultural studies, sometimes more broadly, is, if you like, one strand of what is now being called environmental humanities. But the second sense in which that term is being used, and the one that I think of as the most sort of significant, if you like, and more recent development, is the creation of interdisciplinary, a kind of a new interdiscipline. So it's not just like those discrete things, those discrete, environmental philosophy there, environmental literary studies there, but actually they're actually kind of coming together in new interdisciplinary formations. And the precise character of those formations varies with the scholar concerned, but also the location, the institutional location within which that particular interdisciplinary amalgam has been developed. And so I should say that that my own kind of formation within this interdisciplinary zone of the environmental humanities was Australian, was specifically Australian, and it was with the creation of the National Working Group on the Ecological Humanities, as we called it, back in actually 1999, but really taking off in the early 2000s. That this is now, I think, understood internationally as one of the sites of emergence of what is now being called environmental humanities. And we got together, a bunch of us coming from different disciplines and also in conversation with natural scientists. It was under the aegis of the Centre for Resource and Environmental Studies at the Australian National University, and strongly supported by the director of that centre, who was an ecologist at the time. We came together because we felt that we'd each been working away within our own disciplines, trying to cultivate a kind of ecological perspective, but remaining more or less marginal within our disciplines and not really having much visibility beyond academia. And so we came together specifically to see if by actually developing new kinds of interdisciplinary collaborations and methodologies, we could really fire this up and also give it a kind of a sharper link with the major challenges that were becoming ever more pressing at the beginning of the 21st century, not only climate change, but also biodiversity loss and various forms of pollution. Now also, of course, we're very concerned about microplastics and so on. So it's really the whole gamut of environmental or socio-ecological challenges that we were concerned to confront by creating this interdiscipline and inventing new methodologies as well.
Thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive description of environmental humanities, because those who earlier starters, like when I started back in 2012, I had the idea that it's eco-criticism is environmental humanities. And as I started reading, I found myself that I'm lost in an ocean, because there are all these different disciplines. And at the end of the day, I had to engage with a lot of them to be able to make head and tail out of what eco-criticism is. And as you rightly mentioned, Australian academics have, there are a lot of great names, Val Plumwood, Deborah Rose, and you yourself and some others that I don't remember at the moment, who've made a lot of contributions to environmental humanities. And I was wondering, one of the early people in literary studies who talked about environmental eco-criticism, let's say, was Jonathan Bates. And I think he used the works of Michele, if I'm not mistaken, the French philosopher, Natural Contract. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little.
Yes, absolutely. Jonathan Bate, British literary scholar, was really the first eco-critic to focus in on climate change as, a really huge, difficult and critical issue. And that was already in 1996. He edited a special issue of Studies in Romanticism called Green Romanticism. And it's in that special issue that he announces a new agenda for literary studies, which he called Global Warming Criticism. So, John was very much, ahead of the game in engaging with this. And the other thing that was really innovative in John's approach to this was his turn to the work of Michele. And in particular, so the idea of the natural contract is with reference to the social contract, which was a really powerful idea, particularly associated with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but other thinkers, a really powerful agenda, if you like, for creating a kind of emancipated society, and influenced some of the intellectuals who kind of threw their weight behind the French Revolution. But what Serre says is that that's no longer enough We need a natural contract. And what he argues, so he's a historian of science, historian and philosopher of science. And what he argues is that the sort of modern institutionalization of knowledge and indeed politics has severed the natural world from the social world. And, you know, you can see that in university faculties. You know, you've got the natural sciences, and then you've got the, you know, the arts, humanities, and social sciences over there. And in German, the German term for the humanities is Geisteswissenschaften, which is the knowledge of the mind or spirit. Geist is cognate with the English ghost. So the implication there, if you've got a faculty of Naturwissenschaften, sciences of nature, over there, and you've got Geisteswissenschaften, sciences of the mind, over here, is that the mind is exclusively human, because that's all the scholars in the humanities are concerning themselves with. And that nature, that the human is somehow outside of nature, and that nature is somehow mindless, right? So this is a dualism that shapes modern knowledge, Western knowledge systems, but also shapes our politics. And so the idea of the natural contract was to overcome this kind of dualism between nature and society, and recognize how the two have always been entangled, and how the other than human should be understood as part of the polity. Sayre talks about the parliament of things. That the non-human should have representation, non-human interests and agency should be incorporated into our political systems, and that our knowledge needs to break free of these separations. So it's a really kind of helpful philosophy, if you like, for the environmental humanities, because the project of the environmental humanities is, after all, to cross that great divide between the humanities and the natural sciences, but also between the academic sphere and the wider public sphere, and also other kinds of knowledge. So in Australia, we actually created a manifesto for the ecological humanities. And one of the points of this manifesto was that our research should be inclusive of diverse knowledge systems, including, for instance, Indigenous ecological knowledge, and also Indigenous aspirations for self-determination, and so on. So yes, it's a big agenda, and it was, I think, really very helpful that John brought Sayre into the sort of eco-critical discussion.
Thank you. It was a very interesting point you mentioned about this dichotomy between natural sciences and humanities. This is something all eco-critics or environmentalists that I know have been fighting for, to dismantle this binary. And that actually brings me to my next point that I wanted to ask, which was this material term in literary studies and also in environmental studies as well. And I guess the works of Bruno Latour have been hugely influential in this area. Now the environmental humanities include not only humans, non-humans, but also non-animate entities. And they have this idea of agency, non-human agencies or distributed agencies, which Bruno Latour has been very influential in. And I remember that famous quote from Kate Soper, if I'm not mistaken, that this is not the language that has a hole in it. So I was wondering if you could tell us what material eco-criticism or material environmental humanities is. in this area.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that the so-called new materialism is not all that new. So I'm a scholar of Romanticism, if I'm anything, with a specialist focus. You know, my specialism is I suppose particularly European Romanticism, British and German Romantic literature and thought. And already during that Romantic period, you see, particularly in German philosophy of the period, a pushback against the kind of reductive materialism that treats matter as inert, as atomistic, as devoid of agency, devoid of ethical interest. So the Romantics were already new materialists, and in fact, there's a fantastic book coming out soon on German Romantic empiricism by Dalia Nassar, who is at the University of Sydney in philosophy. And she is making a case sort of in a far kind of wider way than I did in my book, Topographies of the Sacred, for the kind of new, if you like, what we'd now say the kind of new materialist, new empiricist character of German Romantic era thought. But I also really want to emphasize that some of the people that you mentioned before in Australia, Debbie Rose, Val Plumwood, I would add Freya Matthews, were articulating a kind of neo-materialist philosophy years ago. So, in her book, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature from 1996, Plumwood talks about other than human agency and interests. She talks about the telos, even of a river. The river has its own kind of agenda, if you like, to wind its way to the sea, or in the case of some peculiar Australian rivers, to wind their way inland. So this was back in 1996. And in 1991, Freya Matthews, environmental philosopher, who was another kind of founding member of the Australian Ecological Humanities, wrote a book called The Ecological Self, in which she draws upon the work of Baruch Spinoza, the Jewish philosopher, who was also actually very influential in German Romanticism, which is partly why German Romanticism was kind of neo-materialist. But she draws upon Spinoza's concept of conatus, the sort of impulse within entities to kind of realize themselves, to extend themselves, to talk about the more than human, including inanimate. And then Debbie Rose, you know, right from the get-go, was, you know, concerned with a trans-species ethic, which was very much informed by the work that she'd done over many years with Indigenous peoples in the Victoria River district of Northern Australia. So you already had these concepts of the agency and also the interests, the ethical considerability of the non-human, including the non-animate, was integral to the emergence of the ecological humanities in Australia. But then subsequently in the 2000s, other voices started kind of being more widely engaged with, particularly by eco-critics. And these were indeed Bruno Latour, with his sort of actor network theory, also Karen Barad, with her concept of material semiotic interaction and entanglement. She's of course a physicist by training, but has an amazing knack for conveying contemporary physics to non-physicists. Donna Haraway, somebody else working history and philosophy of science, or science and technology studies, I suppose I should say. Concepts of symbiosis, so kind of co-creation with more than human others. Also Stacey Alamo's concept of transcorporeality, that our bodies are not sort of sealed at the skin, but that matter flows between and across bodies, often in very troubling ways, causing disease. And so on. And also another field that is part of this whole kind of new materialist discussion is biosemiotics. Research on semiotic processes that are now seen to be taking place within and between all kinds of, well, basically all living organisms, but also in their interaction with the sort of physical environment. So I suppose there are a diversity of new materialisms with different emphases, and sometimes object-oriented ontology is included in there as well, although somebody like Timothy Morton, who is most frequently cited probably by eco-critics when they talk about disavows materialism. He says he's not a materialist. So I think there are also important distinctions and nuances in this field. And so it's probably safer to talk of new materialisms, diverse new materialisms. But what they share is, in various ways, this resistance to reductive accounts of matter, which is sort of rightly or wrongly historically associated with Descartes and Newton in particular. But even though they themselves are probably not as reductive as their philosophy is seen to be these days. But so yes, it's this emphasis on the kind of, you know, vibrant agentic dimension of material entities beyond the human, and also, I guess, of our own materiality, and of our entanglement, the entanglement of the human with diverse and particular non-human others, including inanimate entities. And I emphasize the particular. I always remember Debbie Bird Rose saying, everything is connected is just porridge. And that what matters ecologically, ethically, politically, socially, are the particular interconnections and interrelationships and interdependencies that particular, you know, people and non-humans have, and that's what we need to look at. And that's, I suppose, at the heart of one of the new methodologies that has emerged within the environmental humanities, which I particularly find exciting, which is multi-species ethnography. Going back to, you know, the character of the environmental humanities, what I think is really distinctive about these kind of newer interdisciplinary adventures and transdisciplinary adventures is that they often incorporate methods from the qualitative social sciences, particularly ethnography. And I think that really is a distinctive development compared with the practice of, you know, eco-criticism previously, which really, it was engaging with ecological questions. Eco-critics were reading different archives, like Jonathan Bate reading the archive of weather reports in his rereading of Byron's Darkness. You know, no literary scholar had ever gone off to meteorological archives to interpret that poem before. So they're looking at different archives, they're raising different questions, but basically it's still hermeneutic and historical, the methodology is still basically text bound, reading, analyzing, interpreting texts and contextualizing them, perhaps in some new ways, importantly new ways, but still bound within the methodologies that literary studies had historically had. Whereas, what I find really exciting is the invitation, the incitement, the impulse to actually engage other kinds of methodologies as well, whether collaboratively by working with ethnographers or even venturing out and kind of doing ethnography oneself, as I'm trying to do in my current project. So I mean, you asked about material eco-criticism, to come back to your original question. So I guess material eco-criticism is environmental, literary and cultural studies that is engaging with, drawing on insights from this body of new materialisms. But it may also involve going beyond narrowly literary critical studies to incorporate some aspects of social research.
Thank you. When I wanted to study the new materialism, I was first started with Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matters, but then I was, just like you mentioned, there are these different new materialisms, and I was drawn into, and I had to study Karen Barat, Bruno Latour, Spacey Alema, and all of them informed my work. It was just like putting different pieces of puzzle together to get a holistic picture of how we can better approach environmental studies or environmental matters through the lens of new materialism. And right, you mentioned, I was talking to somebody some time ago about affect theory, and he mentioned exactly the same point as you did, that affect is not as new as people claim to be. Spinoza has been writing about affect, even about materialism, as you rightly mentioned. It's just that we are, and even romantic, because I also did, I also studied romantic literature. And when you read the works of British romantic literature, you still see a lot of, and that's why I guess environmental eco-criticism has a lot of interest in romantic literature. And the idea of, go on, please.
No, I was just going to say also, that was, I mean, many of the writers were very much engaged with, informed by contemporary sciences, including sciences of physiology, of sensibility. Keats, for example, who studied medicine, was really interested in the corporeal basis for emotion. And how our emotions and state of mind can be inflected by our physical environment, our physiological response to environment. And I discussed that in my most recent book in relation to his ode to autumn. It's, I think, again, the materialist interest in kind of physiology and psychology that informs this poetry has not been well appreciated until more recently.
By the way, the book that you mentioned about German Romanticism that is coming out by Dalia Nassa, she's the author of, I think she earlier wrote a book about female German philosophers. I'm just trying to find if she's the same author.
No, I'm not familiar with that one. If she is the author of that book, she's published a book called The Romantic Absolute, which is, she's a philosopher, and this is very much sort of hardcore German philosophy of the idea, idealist philosophy, which she and I both argue, and others I think are arguing now too, is actually materialist, kind of what was called idealism is actually a kind of new materialism. She also co-edited a book called The Relevance of Romanticism.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll check her book out. And there's this another term that has by recent, I mean, the past 5 or 6 years has gained more traction, and that is Anthropocene. And I guess one of my friends sent me some series of books on eco-criticism, and one of them was a literary Anthropocene. So I was wondering if you could tell us what Anthropocene is and how does literature engage with that idea? And then we'll come back to the book you wrote in 2015, Dancing with Disaster. Because I'd love to talk about Mary Shelley's The Last Man as well, because it's very, very relevant to today's pandemic.
It is indeed. So the Anthropocene was proposed by a couple of scientists, and Critson and Sturmer some years ago now, to refer to a new geological era, a new era in the history of the planet, characterized by the predominance of human activity significantly changing the planet in ways that would be visible in the geological record, like millennia into the future, if there's anybody to look at that record. But whether or not there is, the changes will be there to see. There will be the spike in CO2. There will be evidence of mass extinction. There will be a lot of new materials like plastics and steel and glass and so on. As has subsequently been discussed, also masses of chicken bones. And also, it's one of the signals of the Anthropocene, our completely excessive, well, when I say our, which is a question I'll come back to in a moment, in the sort of, I suppose, wealthy consumer nations, excessive consumption of mass-produced, cheaply, cruelly produced chickens. This is one of the signals. But another signal, of course, is radioactivity from atomic testing and bombs. So this term was proposed and it's being debated by the World Stratigraphic Society, I think it's called, but basically by geologists. So geologists will have the final say on whether this really does constitute a new era in Earth's history. But the general idea is that human activities have and are profoundly reshaping the Earth, and in ways that are going to be, continue to have an impact into the deep future, an unimaginably long period of time. Of course, the term has been much debated, and I find it quite problematic because it implies that some amorphous humanity has brought about these changes, whereas in fact it's a minority of humanity, and it's basically, the older industrialized nations, particularly if you're looking at climate change as one of the key markers of the so-called Anthropocene. This starts in Britain during the Romantic period, in fact, with fossil-fueled industrialization, fossil-fueled capitalist and colonialist industrialization. Of course, that pattern of industrialization, fossil-fueled industrialization, is spreading throughout the world, and other nations are very much caught up in it now. But the term Anthropocene kind of veils the inequitable character of both those who have caused these changes, but what it also veils is the inequitable distribution of the impacts of these changes. And this, of course, was very much to the fore, has been in previous climate change conventions as well, but very much to the fore in COP26 in Glasgow, with the call of the most vulnerable nations to have acknowledgement of the loss and damage that climate change is already wreaking in places where which are kind of least responsible for climate change. I myself have done some research in Kiribati in the South Pacific, which is one of these nations of coral atolls in the Pacific that will disappear under the waves if we go beyond 1.5, and that it's already experiencing increased flooding, also increasing cyclones, which they've never had before, and so on and so forth. So Anthropocene is kind of problematic term, and people have come up with various alternatives to it. I come up with an alternative in my most recent book too, but we needn't go there for the moment. But yeah, so this is now, of course, very much informing eco-critical research, and eco-critics are engaging with the science of the Anthropocene in a both critical and creative way. So contributing to the debate around the very term, but also taking on board the reality that that we need to think in different timescales. And so, for example, there's a book that I really value by David Farrier called Anthropocene Poetics: Deep Time, Sacrifice Zones and Extinction, from 2019, which brings a kind of geological lens to bear in his engagement with poetic texts, but also an engagement with deep futures, climate changed futures, for example, in the literature of climate fiction, cli-fi as it's sometimes called. I mean, of course, science fiction has always engaged with deep futures, but we're now seeing, an increasing amount of engagement by writers of science fiction and speculative fiction with the challenges of the so-called Anthropocene and the potential implications and potential, pathways, and potentially alternative pathways as well.
That was an excellent point you brought up about the term Anthropocene being problematic, because it assumes that, everybody in the world has the same share of the damage they have done to the environment. And I guess one of the alternative terms that I came across was Capitalocene. But as you mentioned, there are several alternatives, but still none of them has caught on as Anthropocene.
That's right. Yeah.
And you wrote this wonderful book, Dancing with Disaster, which I must say was a savior to me, because I was reading Mary Shelley's The Last Man, and was trying to write a chapter on that. I knew there was a lot of potential in this book, but I didn't know how to approach that theoretically. And that's where I got more engaged with the idea of Anthropocene. And the amazing thing about this novel is that it was written about roughly 2 centuries ago, and with a plague taking over the earth, and the plague travels through the routes of commerce routes. Then you have the economic disparities, plague being democratic, which is of course not the case. We know people used to say that pandemic COVID-19 is also democratic, which is not the case. We know there are still a lot of vulnerable societies that are damaged, that are affected more. And even the ideas of race and war were brought up in this novel, and all of them somehow came, maybe not war, but all of them came true. I mean, we witnessed a lot of these issues last year with the pandemic. And you wrote a chapter, or one of the chapters of your book was on Mary Shelley's The Last Man. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, and also the idea of eco-disaster, which you prefer to natural disaster, which is a very important distinction you make.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the problem with the concept of natural disaster is that it belongs very much to what Michele calls the modern constitution, which separates, nature and society. And it's interesting to look at its historical emergence, which is sort of mid to late 19th century. It's actually a really recent coinage. And on the one hand, it is a kind of secular discourse of disaster, which rejects sort of mythic and religious conceptions of calamities such as, plague, droughts, whatever else associated with the natural world, as brought about by the gods to punish human beings. So the natural disaster wants to get away, is kind of signaling a break from that concept. In fact, you can go, kind of right back for many centuries and see that that notion was not by no means universally held, for even back to sort of, later antiquity, and certainly through the Middle Ages and later. But nonetheless, the problem is that it veils human culpability for creating the conditions in which a disaster unfolds. So I was very inspired by the work of the anthropologists of anthropology of disaster, which highlights that a disaster occurs where sort of nature, society, and technology meet, and it unfolds within that entanglement. And so you have kind of extreme events that might take place in the natural world, which may not be caused by human agency, such as an earthquake, for example, or a volcano. Well, these days, earthquakes can be brought on by fracking, it seems. And other kinds of human intervention. But nonetheless, you do have these events that don't have any human agency. But whether or not they are a disaster and how disastrous they are depends upon a raft of social and cultural factors. So it depends on whether people are living in a zone that is prone to those sorts of things, also how they are living there. If they have cultures that are attuned to those extreme events and able to respond to them, to anticipate them, and to minimize their vulnerability in the face of them, or whether they live in a kind of denial of their vulnerability, which then actually just makes them more vulnerable. And then the other factor is that these disastrous events are not necessarily equitable in their impacts. So, for example, we saw that very powerfully, I think, with Hurricane Katrina, where poorer and Black populations of New Orleans were far more vulnerable to the impacts of that. And this is commonly the case, that people who are already disadvantaged for other reasons are particularly vulnerable in the face of these kinds of calamities. So I became particularly concerned about the continued use of the term natural disaster in the face of weatherborne disasters that climatologists believed were partially caused by global warming. And so by calling, this was particularly the case in Australia, with the increasing frequency and intensity of droughts and fires, and indeed flooding and cyclones. So Cyclone Yasi in 2013 was the biggest recorded cyclone ever to hit Australia. It was clearly, it's now known clearly that the size of these cyclonic storms is affected by the warmth of the oceans. The oceans were uncommonly warm because they'd been absorbing so much of heat that was being produced throughout burning of fossil fuels, and yet it was referred to as a natural disaster, and it was demonized. If you look at the press reports, Cyclone Yasi roars in as if it's a kind of rampaging beast, a lion, roaring in. So the human culpability and also non-human vulnerability are both failed. So that term, I think, encourages a view that there's kind of nasty, wild nature over there that's going to come and biff us. And we humans just have to kind of stick together and be mates. Strong discourse in Australian settler colonial culture. We just got to be matey together and against this nasty, wild nature. This is profoundly unhelpful because, again, to take the case of Australia, major contributor to global warming through our coal exports. Also with the highest per capita CO2 emissions in the world, even though our CO2 emissions themselves are small. So there we are, sort of demonizing nature and not recognizing our own hand in these storms and these firestorms that are descending upon us. So this is why I propose a term eco-catastrophe, and a catastrophe in the sense of a turning point as well. Catastrophe in the sense of being a revelatory moment as well. That's the original meaning of apocalypse as well. Apocalypse is simply to reveal. What we need to get better at doing is seeing what is being revealed by these calamities and seeing what they are calling upon us to do in response, both to mitigate the causes of these disasters and also to prepare better for facing them, because they're going to keep coming and they're going to get worse, even if we do manage to limit CO2 or global warming to 1.5 degrees. So this informs my whole book. And what I found so interesting about Mary Shelley's The Last Man, as you say, is that it provides a kind of analysis of the spread of this disease. So the characters kind of demonize this plague. They do this othering of this is nasty nature in its most horrible form. It's a kind of monstrous kind of feminine, although the gendering of the plague is slightly ambivalent, but it's this kind of monstrous nature over yonder. But what Shelley shows through her narrative is that the plague is kind of released into the world in the context of war, and a war that is also a war of colonial conquest. It's about, and also very interesting from a Middle Eastern perspective, because the project is to reclaim Constantinople for the West, right, for Christendom, as in that's Istanbul today, obviously, and the project is to subdue all Asia. So it's in the context of this kind of also kind of gendered hyper-masculine project of colonial conquest that the disease first it kind of comes into kind of Western Europe, and then it spreads throughout the world, as you said before, through trade and through colonialism. And so Shelley really sort of subverts this othering of the plague and really highlights human culpability. And she also, so interestingly, explores different kinds of responses to this, and in a sense rehearses what I would call an ethics of disaster, advancing a kind of ethic of solidarity and also of interracial, transnational and interracial solidarity, and mutual kind of care and self-help in the face of this calamity. It's extremely interesting, I think, from that. It's way too long. She needed a really good editor. Like, you know, it is quite a thing to struggle through it. It's just like, yeah, this needed a good edit. But nonetheless, it's extremely interesting. And the other thing that I find fascinating is that the narrator, who begins with a very much a humanist perspective, a human exceptionalist perspective, I would say, and quite ethnocentric, you know, kind of British as well, comes around to really questioning his presuppositions, including the presupposition of human human exceptionalism and of human mastery. And he recognizes how other living beings are actually flourishing anew as the human population is declining. And there's a kind of dare I say it, post-humanism, not anti-humanism, but a kind of a post-humanism in this book, which made it unreadable in the 19th century. You know, it went out of print. It wasn't republished until basically feminist literary scholars took it up, you know, in the late 20th century. And it was just appalling for 19th century humanists to read this this sort of a kind of a degree of equanimity about the disappearance of humanity, and the sort of recolonization of human spaces by plants, assorted plants and animals, and so on. But so there are, I think, some interesting, as you say, interesting sort of parallels with our current pandemic, but also differences. So one thing that you don't really learn about is, you know, what actually is this disease? And of course, epidemiology was in its infancy in those days as well. So that's part of it. But I think one of the things that that COVID-19 has revealed is also human, non-human entanglements, which are both material and also ethical. So there may be still some question marks about the exact origins of this disease, but it seems likely that it had to do with you know, with trade in actually endangered species, perhaps, and certainly with, you know, human meat consumption and mistreatment of animals in the meat industry, and several other new diseases have arisen from intensive farming. And in my book, I talk about another huge public health risk, which is the growth of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And these have arisen not only from the overprescription of antibiotics to people, but especially from the use of antibiotics in intensive farming, which is, of course, also incredibly cruel. So COVID-19 reveals that entanglement, but I think, you know, as you also gestured towards, it also very much reveals the social inequities in its, you know, who are kind of vulnerable to it. Obviously, the elderly are more vulnerable, but also poorer people who are suffering from ill health for other reasons, which are often socio-ecological, like they're living in really polluted cities. This is a risk factor for COVID-19. And then there's a whole question of, you know, who gets the vaccines and so on and so forth. So, yeah, a whole set of entanglements.
Yeah, thank you. That was an excellent explanation about the book and also the distinction between natural disasters and eco-catastrophes. And it's fascinating how much I don't remember the name of the eco-critic that I read some time ago, and she made the point that natural disasters should first and foremost be considered, or let's say be approached through a cultural lens so that we can educate the public. And I guess this novel, alongside also the novel that Jonathan Swift wrote, I think it was called The Journal of the Year of Plague, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But in that one, even you can clearly see that the people who are more economically disadvantaged are more exposed to environmental risks or to pandemics. And there have been numerous reports as well that in the United States, the Black communities in areas which were, again, economically disadvantaged had a far higher rates of being affected by the pandemic. And these are all the issues that have been artistically and creatively been narrated and told through works of literature. And this is the importance of environmental humanities in this respect. Yeah. I've taken much more of your time than I originally asked for, Kate. So I won't take more of your time. Thank you very, very much for this wonderful conversation. I've personally learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers will benefit enormously from this conversation.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed our conversation as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a very good day.